As head of state, I didn't want to register anonymously. I had to be the example in order to encourage the rest of the country who were of voting age to follow my lead. And it also helps in officially launching the election process.
But it's an election process that's already been full of controversy. Official polls in the Central African Republic are set for October, but many citizens say this is overambitious for a country that's been wrought by ethnic and sectarian violence. The nation has seen 3 presidents in less than 3 years and is largely being propped up by France, the UN and the AU. So, how realistic are the country's election plans, and what will it take to find peace in the Central African Republic? I'm Penina Karibe. Welcome to Talk Africa. The overthrow in March 2013 of the Central African Republic President Francois Bozizé by the predominantly Muslim C.A.R. rebels triggered violence between the country's Muslim minority and Christian majority, and over 2 years later, the African nation is still struggling to find peace. Now, to understand the magnitude of the crisis, let's take a look at some statistics. Now, since December 2013, approximately 25% of C.A.R's population has been internally displaced. That's according to the UNHCR. Now, in early 2014, at the peak of the crisis, more than 930,000 people were uprooted from their homes, and nearly 2.7 million people, that's more than half of C.A.R's population, are in need of assistance. Now, this conflict has had a regional impact, with more than 190,000 C.A.R. refugees having fled to Cameroon, Chad and DRC. Now, approximately 508,000 people remain internally displaced in the C.A.R. Now, the French have about 2,000 boots on the ground, according to April's Security Council forecast for the C.A.R. And C.A.R. is a former French colony. Now, on its part, the UN approved a 12,000-strong peacekeeping force for the country. In January last year, Catherine Samba-Panza took over the helm after regional leaders forced interim leader Michel Jotodia, in the wake of escalating sectarian violence, to leave office. But tension remains high in the C.A.R. and the upcoming elections in October are steeped in uncertainty. So, just how ready is the country for elections? Well, voter registration is currently underway and is seen as the first true test of efficiency for the new National Elections Authority, as key obstacles have to be cleared to ensure its success.
Central African Republic will hold presidential and parliamentary elections on October 18th. Seen by many as critical to drawing a line under the 2-year interreligious conflict witnessed by the landlocked nation. The polls in the charge of a transitional authority have repeatedly been delayed, and a National Peace Forum last month said that a previous timetable that would have seen elections held in June or July was unrealistic. The voters' list will first be used during the referendum to vote for the new constitution of the country on October 4th, 2015, then for the general elections on October 18th. According to officials from the Transitional Authority, the new election calendar had been agreed upon following a meeting between government officials and donors.
Today marks the first day of the official launch of voter registration, which will go throughout the country until July 27th.
A second round of elections, if required, will be held on November 22nd. The polls will require a total budget of $34.6 million, of which around half had already been collected from government resources and donor funding, according to officials.
I feel very happy because the right to vote is unfortunately not a right that is given to everyone in the world. So it's a privilege for me to vote.
I must say I'm very emotional, because for a long time we didn't think these elections would take place, and now, here today, we have the launch of the voter registration process. I'm very happy and looking forward to what's to come.
The Central African Republic remains one of Africa's biggest humanitarian crises. About 440,000 people are displaced inside the country, and a further 450,000 refugees have fled its borders. Although the violence in the nation has eased in recent months, sporadic killings still occur, fueled by criminality, and deep divisions between Muslims and Christians persist. Matthew Edwards, CCTV.
Now, since the turmoil in the C.A.R. began, peacekeeping and policing responsibilities have fallen largely under the UN Multidimensional Integrated Stabilization Mission in the Central African Republic, or simply MINUSCA as it's called. I recently sat down with the force's police commissioner, Luis Carrillo, to find out more about the challenges they face in raiding the country for elections.
I would divide two responsibilities. One is every country in the world has criminality, and that through a community policing approach, working with the community leaders, working with the community, working with the population, having trust, building trust, orient the policing, so global criminality. And then there is the other type of criminality that justifies the presence of the peacekeeping mission here and of the international police, and that is of where the society is not able to be properly in balance. We had here serious clashes between communities that then, through radicalism of religious and ethnic nature, fought. As we could see, there were several people that died, and on that sense, it is our responsibility to build bridges of trust. And it is our responsibility now to help the national institutions, particularly in our case, the police, and of course the Minister of Security, to build this type of relationship. But to build the relationship, we need hardware and software. We have a project with the support of the international community, channeled through the PNUD, the United Nations Development Program, together with us, MINUSCA, to rebuild the commissariats and the brigades of gendarmerie and the national police here in Bangui. And it is going on, because it's important to be where the communities are. And on that sense, the proximity is built with the commissariats, with the brigades. At the same time, we develop structures in terms of patrolling, either foot patrol, that is essential to assure the community, either vehicle patrol, more effective. And then a more robust type of policing. The right to freely circulate is a right that everyone is entitled to. And sometimes some people block the road. Either they block the road for problems of social origin, salaries, education, rights that if people think that they are entitled to protest. However, it's a balance between the right to circulate and there is no right to block the road. In other way, sometimes there are people, because the process of pre-DDR and DDR that derives from the Forum of Bangui is now going in a good direction, but there are criminals with weapons, and it is also our obligation to fight these people, and we have been doing it together with the national security forces and the international forces, so I'm very positive. Challenges is first the reconciliation of the Central African population. MINUSCA, what MINUSCA brings, more maybe than the other missions that were here before, it's the multidimensionality. It's not only police, not only military, it's also human rights, civil affairs, our colleagues of DDR, our colleagues of SSR, our colleagues of child protection, our colleagues of gender protection, our colleagues of the political, our colleagues of the agencies, and together in a network we can help the national institutions as a kind of net protection to move forward. From the police, we are discussing with the national counterparts and with the international counterparts also. There are countries that are supporting. There are agencies of the United Nations. I would stress UNICEF, ONU-FEM, that are always present, FAO, and at the countries, there are countries that are, or organizations that are helping. The European Union, United States, France, and of course, we hope that as we develop more in the future, we can have even more partners to support in terms of development of the national police and the gendarmerie. This is a major challenge to build solid and credible institutions internally and externally. Protection of civilians is in the core of our mandate here, and we have been doing it in Bangui and outside. But the challenges are still there, because it's not only solved by the use of police or military, there are other dimensions. But I am very positive, because the progresses that were done during the last months, since MINUSCA is here, I only can speak since that time because that's when I arrived, but the steps are very, very positive, and the route map that we have now in terms of the political process also very positive.
We're going to take a short break, but when we come back, our expert guests will help unpack the situation in the C.A.R. Stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa, and we continue our discussion around the elusive peace in the Central African Republic, and I have expert guests standing by to help us make sense of the situation. In Johannesburg, Dr. Alfredo Hengari, Senior Research Fellow at the South African Institute of International Affairs. In Geneva, Alexandra Libeskin, he is the Director for Francophone Africa at the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue. And in France, Professor Geoff Toker of the American Graduate School in Paris. Thank you all for joining the discussion. Alexandra, let me begin with you. The security situation in the C.A.R. has obviously improved since the UN peacekeeping mission was set up almost a year ago, but we still see sporadic incidents here and there, still pointing to an unstable and worrying security situation. And just to give you an example, a few weeks back, gunmen attempted to overrun the national radio station in Bangui. So, in your assessment, what is the prevailing security situation in C.A.R. and should there be reason to worry as the country heads into the upcoming election?
Yeah, the prevailing situation is better than what it has been, but it's still far from being perfect. That is, there are pockets of lawlessness, especially in the rural areas. There are spoilers in Bangui that are trying to derail the peace process, but I would say altogether, security, physical security has improved for the inhabitants. There are areas under the control of the international troops, there are areas under the control of armed groups, and there are areas under the control of no one. And these are the difficult areas, I would say. And it will take years until these areas are fully under control. C.A.R. is a huge country. It has been chronically unstable for the last decades. But we are, in my opinion, there is a momentum going for the pacification of the country.
Right. Dr. Hengari, the AU gets a lot of flack. Critics often argue that it is slow to respond to security threats, that it prioritizes power over justice, and that it fails to adequately represent the needs of the continent's over 1 billion citizens. So, has the AU, in your view, effectively played its role in helping secure peace in the C.A.R. alongside other international actors? And is there justification to this criticism of the AU?
Well, I think it is true that the AU has not really been playing the role that is expected of it when it comes to the Central African Republic. You might recall that when the violence escalated to a higher degree, the authorities in the Central African Republic requested the French to intervene, and it was really Operation Sangaris which brought a semblance of order to Bangui. The African Union only took over after the French had more or less secured the capital. So I think the challenge that the AU is facing now is the absence of rapid reaction capacities and the ability to deploy in a short period of time. And that has hampered, to a certain degree, the ability of the African Union to respond effectively to crises such as those in the, such as that in the Central African Republic.
Professor Toka, in spite of the presence of a multiple of international and regional actors that include the UN, France, and the AU, along with the NGOs, peace remains elusive in the C.A.R. 2 years into the conflict. We've just heard Alexandra saying that the country is divided into three parts. We've got, of course, the multinational force controlling some parts of the country. We've got other parts under the control of the armed groups, and other parts, Alexandra says, are under the control of nobody. So, in your view, what can be done differently, and do you believe there is political will to do things differently?
Well, the key word, of course, is political. Is there sufficient political will? Everybody would have liked to think so, to believe in that, but I'm afraid that if we take into account everything that had already been said, my colleague in Geneva was so rightly stating the fact that everything is relative. If we compare the security and even the humanitarian situation in the Central African Republic today to what it was a year ago or even 18 months ago, then of course we're speaking about a significant improvement. Otherwise, if you take a look at the report which was published just a few days ago, we're still speaking humanitarily about 1/4 of the population which is either in a refugee sort of status or semi-refugee status, either on the territory of the Central African Republic itself or in the neighboring countries. So we're speaking about 1 out of 4 citizens of the Central African Republic in a situation which is, could be dramatic. Now, of course, that's much better than what we had witnessed with the real, concrete exchange of fire. Now, the key to advance in all that are the energies, the dynamics that a political process could, may, should produce. And this is precisely the perspective, I believe, of our conversation here, as we're looking forward towards mid-October and late November for the parliamentary and presidential elections that may optimistically produce kind of dynamics which would do well to both the security and the humanitarian situation.
Okay, so let's talk about this goodwill that Professor Toka has brought up. Alexandra, during the Bangui Forum held in May, the various armed groups in the conflict reached a consensus on disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration into civilian life, and some of them into the various national security institutions. But so far, DDR has not been as successful as many would have hoped. Why?
You know, peace building takes a bit of time, and sometimes I have to say the impatience around peace processes is puzzling me. It is already a miracle somehow that through a forum of 7 days of negotiation with 600 people, we managed to have a consensus on a reasonable peace agreement. One key part of the peace agreement, as you mentioned, is the demobilization and reintegration of combatants. And there, one, you need to have a consensus with the armed groups, with the national armed forces, with the international forces, with the donors, on what kind of a concept we are looking at in terms of DDR. What was decided during the Bangui Forum is any combatant will go through a selection process that will give him access to the armed forces or access to some kind of civilian rehabilitation program. So these are extremely complex, heavy, expensive programs, and you are not necessarily dealing with people who have a very high level of education and understanding on the issues at stake and who are mainly looking at their personal interest. So it's a delicate process. I agree that it could go quicker, but there is now some money pledged, there are some means, and I think there is goodwill on all sides, but it does require certainly political will, and it does require the fuel of all this at the end of the day is financial means. And there, I hope that the states who have shown great care and anxiety about the future of C.A.R. will also deliver in terms of supporting the DDR program.
Dr. Hengari, let me come to you because, of course, given what Alexander is talking about, we still have a significant number of weapons and civilian arms. And I want to talk about the point of elections that Professor Toka just talked about. We obviously have worrying statistics here. A huge number of people, 25% of civilians from the C.A.R. displaced internally. So given all of these dynamics, is this country ready for elections? Are those groups that are saying that elections should be postponed to June or August next year, do they have a legitimate concern?
Well, these are clearly legitimate concerns. The Central African Republic at this point in time, or even by November, by October when the elections are expected to take place, the authorities will not be ready to carry out those elections in a manner that speaks to the challenges that we have today. So I do think that it's a legitimate concern and the elections ought to be postponed to next year. The challenge at times that is facing the international community is to try and normalize political processes through elections. And in some instances, elections also generate new problems of their own. So in this case, it's important to first deal with the question of political inclusivity, the question of political dialogue, which is at this point in time is still disparate. It's going in different directions, and you do have, as the previous speaker mentioned, you do have areas within the country that are still outside the control of the state. So it begs the question as to whether you can really have credible elections when the state does not have monopoly on violence.
And Professor Toka, let me just throw that question to you. Dr. Hengari talking about a credible election. But when you look at these numbers, Professor Toka, 25% of people in C.A.R. displaced internally, 500,000 people thereabout, refugees in countries such as Chad and Cameroon, and yet you're heading to the polls. C.A.R. authorities saying that these people who are refugees will not be included in this process. So can it still be deemed as credible? And what's going to be the impact of excluding these people in the peace and reconciliation efforts as well as cohesion?
Indeed, this is a very pertinent point, which about international organizations of all nature were, had alarmed just very recently about what's going to happen about those who, at least theoretically, have the right to vote but do not stay physically on the territory of the Central African Republic comes mid-October or late November. I don't believe the problem has been resolved in terms of principle, and I'm even more doubtful about the practical, concrete measures which could be taken or perceived in order to assure that. But let me come back to the very important point our colleague in Johannesburg had just made. Elections, most historical and recent experiences show us over 5 continents that electoral processes could, and in the majority of cases indeed are, altogether positive in a context of tormented political, military, social, humanitarian situations. Namely, they bring about more positive elements than negative elements. Having said that, there are exclusions to that sort of experience which history shows us. There are electoral processes, and there have been electoral processes in different countries, in different contexts, in which the very fact of the political so-called electoral competition had produced by its own dynamics damages and violence and crystallization of the conflicts which had torn nations and ethnic groups and continents sometimes apart. We don't know yet which way it may turn over the coming 5-6 months, which right now separates us from the electoral dates. Now, of course, the temptation is to say, let's just let's just delay it. How about next summer? Rather than next autumn. I'm not sure that that's the mechanical sort of solution which would be profitable, but it's certainly on the table to see and watch and eventually adjust when we see how the electoral campaign, the pre-electoral campaign, is going on.
Dr. Hengari, let me come to you. Looking at France's relationship with its former African colonies, it appears to be quite different from other colonial masters, such as Britain, for instance, where we see France having a direct involvement with the affairs of the former colonies. So what is this relationship exactly that exists between France and its former colonies here in the continent?
Well, I think it's important to also echo the sentiments of the previous speaker. I think at this point in time, one should not look at the relationship of France with the former French colonies through the perspective of continuity. There has been, over the past 15 years, important ruptures. What used to be known then as La France Afrique is no longer the sort of the dot that connects Africa with France. I think that era is gone now. There has been a high degree of transparency now in the Franco-African relationships. It's also important to mention here that the French government has undertaken an extensive review of its military posture in Africa, and a very significant reduction of military personnel on the continent, because in the past it was based on relations that were quite, in some instances, opaque. There's a high degree of transparency because public opinion in Africa has also evolved. Public opinion in France also has evolved when it comes to this type of relationship. So I think one cannot really look at it in terms of sort of a one-dimensional relationship that would benefit France or specific African leaders. I think the point to emphasize here is that French action now in Africa is really based on, I'm mentioning that, I'm saying this with a certain degree of caution, but also confidence that the relationship is now based on a high degree of norms that govern these interventions. And I think it's also important to mention here that when the French intervened in the Central African Republic, it was not out of their own will. The authorities in Bangui requested an intervention by France. And I can also mention the other example in recent years, that is Operation Serval in Mali. It was the transitional president in Bamako, Dianguna Traore, who requested that France intervenes in Mali in order to sort of avoid the advance of the Tuareg rebels on Bamako. So I think it's a different type of relationship. It involves now more actors as well, which creates space for a better refinement of this type of interventions.
All right, let's leave it there for now. Gentlemen, it's been great having your insights on Talk Africa this week. A big thanks to all of you. Professor Geoff Toker joining us from Paris, Dr. Alfredo Hengari joining us from Johannesburg, and Alexandra Libeskin joining us from Geneva. Once again, thank you for joining us. All, do remember, you can join the conversation at home through Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. To join us again next week for another edition of Talk Africa. From me, Penina Karibe, and the Talk Africa team. Goodbye.